Hello, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Welcome to the second installment of the Alliance Advisors and the Cape Town Stock Exchange's ESG webinar series. We're really excited to present to you all today. This is a three-part webinar series where we're examining environmental, social, and governance, ESG issues in the United States and South Africa to identify key differences and trends that are applicable to both markets. So each installation of the webinar series focuses on a specific issue in the ESG arena. Weeks ago, we did the E-panel. Jane was on that panel as well. I was on it too. It was a really good presentation. And if you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at it, you weren't able to join us live, it is available to view on our website. I'd be happy to distribute it to anybody who is on this presentation but wasn't able to catch the last one. Today's is going to focus on the second issue in the ESG arena, S, social. So let's jump right into it. The pandemic and racial justice protests in the States following, Eugene, I think you might want to mute yourself. I'm hearing a little static. Perfect, awesome, thank you. So as I was saying, the pandemic and the racial justice protests in the United States following the death of George Floyd in the summer of 2020 shined a light on social issues in a new and profound way, with some commenting that ESG had actually started to morph into EESG with a renewed focus on companies' treatment of employees and other stakeholders and really focusing on social policies. Today, institutional investors have a keen focus on human capital management because many believe it can be the most important component of a business's success, particularly in some of the talent-driven industries. The global pandemic also really highlighted the connection between company performance and the treatment of employees, customers, and other stakeholders. Pay equity, gender, and racial diversity at the board level, but also with the overall workforce, have become crucial areas of evaluations for institutional investors when they're looking at companies. There's a renewed interest in the way that companies are treating their workers and the wages that they're paying them. Institutional investors are interested in how companies are investing in employee skills, training, and development, particularly for underrepresented minorities, with the belief that investing in these areas can provide an opportunity for employees to excel and thereby allowing the company to really excel and achieve new heights that it wouldn't otherwise be able to. So today, we're going to delve into some of these key social issues and considerations from a US and South African perspective. If you have any questions, audience, throughout the presentation, please submit them. We have a questions panel where you can just go ahead and type your questions, and then we will either address them during the presentation if we have time, or if we cannot get to them during the presentation, we will respond to you to the best of our abilities directly offline. So before we get started, I want to let you know how to submit your questions and how to participate in today's event. So with that, Marissa, if you wouldn't mind just flipping to the next slide. And so this slide, it shows what you should be seeing kind of on your screens. This is the interface that you should see, and it provides some directions and some insights into how you can submit your questions, or if you have issues with your audio, how you can fix those. So if you have any questions, just type them into the question pane, and you can send them in at any time. I also included a few articles that are in the handout section. So if you want to review some of those materials, whenever you have the chance, you can go ahead and download those materials. They're also available on our website in our insights and news sections. So if you have an opportunity, there's some great resources that provide overviews of some of the key policy changes for advisory firms and other institutional investors for the upcoming or now beginning 2022 proxy season. So before we jump into the conversation in earnest, let me start by introducing myself, and then each of the panelists will go ahead and introduce themselves. So my name is Brian Valerio. I'm a Senior Vice President, SVP in the advisory group at Alliance Advisors. I advise C-suite executives, board members, and their advisors on a variety of issues across the corporate governance, proxy solicitation, shareholder engagement, and E&S space. I do a lot of work in the fall with companies on their institutional outreach, where they connect directly with some of their largest shareholders to discuss their policies and practices. A lot of those conversations will frame kind of some of the insights that I might share today, and then also do a lot of work with companies on the proxy solicitation side starting in the spring, so it's really ramping up now. So that's kind of my role and the perspective that I'll provide for today. Sarah, do you want to provide a little introduction to your roles?
Sure. Thanks so much, Brian. And it's great to be with all of you today. My name is Sarah Fort. I'm a partner in the Austin and Washington, D.C. offices of Latham & Watkins. I am also the global co-chair of ESG across the platform. In that role, I provide public companies and other organizations with support, including with respect to their ESG strategies, their ESG disclosure, their ESG integration, including the integration of ESG KPIs, metrics, and targets, and of course, ESG activism and ESG litigation. And I think I'm handing it off to Eugene.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Eugene Boyson, CEO of the Cape Town Stock Exchange. We're one of the new exchanges in South Africa, providing a marketplace and venue for our clients to raise both debt and equity. The exchange are massive advocates of the ESG principles and also sustainable finance, very pertinent in South Africa at the moment and very topical. Looking forward to having a very social discussion on social. Thank you. Pierre, to you.
Thank you, Eugene. Hi, everyone. My name is Pierre Swart. I'm a partner at the Johannesburg office of Fasken in South Africa, and I'm a capital markets and banking and finance lawyer. Over to you, Francois.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and good morning for our international guests. I'm a partner in the Johannesburg office of Fasken. We are a Canadian-based law firm with offices around the world. I'm on our ESG steering committee as well as climate change and climate litigation. And also hoping that social will not be regarded as too social, but more important within the ESG chain. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for participating in today's webinar. We're going to start the conversation with an overview of some of the most important social issues from a US and South African perspective. I'll kick it off on the US side. So while the E in ESG might get more attention in the media, many institutional investors are equally or perhaps even more focused on the S. The focus on S issues has really grown exponentially in recent years. As I mentioned, the death of George Floyd was a real catalyst for this, as well as the pandemic. And following these instances, many companies made public statements in support of racial justice, and investors were really listening to these statements. These investors expect company practices to match these statements. Institutional investors are examining how companies are advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives, with some of the biggest hurdles being tackling unconscious bias. BlackRock, for example, expects companies to disclose actions they're taking to support a diverse workforce and how that aligns with their overall business strategy and model. Institutional investors are interested in pay strategies and how companies are using their pay strategies to attract and retain employees and incentivize productivity. Boards are highly focused on talent management due to the Great Resignation and the war on talent that is causing employers to navigate a uniquely competitive employment market. So these are just some of the topics that are top of mind on the S side in the United States. We also might talk about some of the issues around a just transition. I know that that's something that Sarah intends to discuss and provide a little context around that later today. So let's turn to the South African perspective. Francois, do you want to provide an overview of some of the key issues that you guys are seeing? Francois, I think you're still muted. We're having difficulty hearing you.
My apologies. Back on exit. In South Africa, our approach to ESG has certainly seen the same approach that on global terms, that there's a couple of large multinationals and the larger outfits that understand ESG, the application of ESG and where it fits in. For most other part is ESG is still part of this very woolly approach, and specifically the S, they see as managing relationships with employees or suppliers and customers and communities in which they operate. Of course, we know that there's specifically in respect of the larger definition of ESG, the social component relate to far more important issues. Well-being and interests of people and communities. These include human rights, labor standards in the supply chain, child and slave and bonded labor, workplace health and safety, freedom of association and freedom of expression, human capital management and employee relations, diversity, relations with local communities, activities in conflict zones, health and access to medicine, HIV, AIDS, consumer protection and controversial weapons. All of those are part of the social change and change aspects that we have seen in the ESG chain. And if one then specifically look at the ESG policy considerations, even from a South African perspective, people are used to ESG in its previous formats as CS, corporate social responsibility, or corporate social investment, public relations, environmental compliance as part of your social considerations. For the nice thing is that the South African market, as a global citizen, has also realized that ESG performance must now provide for the inclusion of procedures that clearly demonstrate good corporate citizenship through transparent ethical behavior, environmental awareness, and sound corporate decision making. And really what we've seen here, aligned with the rest of the world, is two specific ESG drivers. One is the impact of companies on social and environmental challenges. And then, almost sounding the same but a little bit different, is the impact of social and environmental trends on companies and investments. And if I can just give you a little bit of background and let our audience see how ESG has transformed from a mere almost voluntary corporate social responsibility initiative to something that is money driven or has become an important consideration in any transaction. These are just the stats from 2021. 80% of asset owners view not integrating ESG factors into the full operational life cycle of their business as a material risk. 65% of institutional investors believe ESG will become a standard regulated practice in the next 5 years. We have seen a 50% growth from 2020 in the number of sustainable funds available. I'm just looking at the United States market. It is double what it was in 2021, and it is sitting now at $51.1 billion. It's double that. It's now almost $110 billion. An estimated $120 billion poured into sustainable investments in 2021. And of the 1,204 community investment institutions, all of them specifically used ESG criteria in their investment analysis, and that totaled a monetary value of about $16.6 trillion under asset management. So if one then look at what ESG issues matters most in terms of real monetary value, we see that in terms of just conflict risk, for instance, on a social perspective, conflict risk was the largest social criteria at $1.8 trillion assets under management. So we see that companies operating, for instance, in developing countries, such as South Africa, can no longer hide behind the international corporate veil and say, look, you sort your social issues out in the local jurisdictions. We have seen international court decisions on that has a social impact perspective dealt to some of the world's largest international companies. Brian, if you then look at strategic business initiatives directly applicable to social considerations, and that is linked to the overall ESG practices, lending and investments activities that currently supports business ownership that is representative of the South African demographics, both including race and gender, is high on the agenda. But also small, medium enterprise development. Various business development support programs focus on addressing challenges in unlocking opportunities for majority Black-owned small and medium enterprises, and at different stages of the business. Supplier development is a very important aspect. Access to finance options for qualifying majority Black-owned suppliers. Suppliers development programs that draws on qualifying Black owner suppliers. Women in business as part of your overall company strategy. Community economy enhancement, employee benefit enhancement, all of those are very important issues for us. And for now, I will hand over to my colleague. Or back
Thank
to you,
you,
Brian.
So thank you. That's really helpful context for some of the key social issues on the South African side. It's also interesting to hear, the stats about the influx of investments in socially conscious and E&S driven funds. I think a lot of that is driven by demand, right? There seems to be demand from a new wave of investors that want to see that their funds are being put to good use and are helping to drive positive change throughout the world. So with that, Sarah, can you dive a little deeper into some of the key issues that we're seeing on the US side in the social context?
Sure, Brian, happy to. So, in the US context, I agree with you. I think, the murder of George Floyd changed the tenor of the conversation. I think in my own practice, in the year following that, I think the number one request I had from my boards was that I speak on social issues, including diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. And, while that was a topic that came up prior to that time, I think there was a heightened awareness, definitely among public companies in particular, that this was an area of both risk and opportunity that needed to be addressed in new ways going forward. But I do want to just point out that particularly when we're looking at the board diversity conversation, that's been a conversation in the US for years. It really began as a conversation around board tenure and independence, and introducing more gender diversity in particular was seen as a way of decreasing average tenure and increasing independence. And so I think it's interesting now to see how this trend has developed, and it really is far more now focused on the actual composition of the board rather than simply on tenure and independence. And I think we see that when we look at the policies that ISS and Glass Lewis came out with recently in recent years around greater gender diversity on boards, greater race and ethnicity representation on boards, as we see those trends develop and those pushes in the U.S., for anyone who's listening who's not aware, ISS and Glass Lewis are the two largest proxy advisory firms in the U.S. They also have policies in other jurisdictions as well. And in the U.S., their policies on board diversity have been kind of ratcheting up, right, over the years. And so now with most of my boards, kind of the summary version, it is more nuanced than this, but the summary version is you really need to start moving towards at least 30% gender and race diversity on your board. So our panel today, I don't think would quite cut it, Brian, but we're moving in the right direction, right? And you see that with a lot of companies. There's a greater push now for that in a way that there hasn't been previously. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the NASDAQ diversity rule. That has not been without its controversy in the U.S., probably to no one's shock on this panel. In the U.S., we can make anything political. This is political. Just for those who maybe aren't aware, the NASDAQ diversity rule does not establish quotas or targets, but it is an explain, basically a disclose and either comply or explain rule that expects a certain level of diversity on boards. But a company could comply with the NASDAQ board diversity rule without having any meaningful diversity on its board. Again, it really is a disclosure focused rule. But again, it has been not without its controversy. I think it's establishing a floor in the US. So even though it's specific for NASDAQ companies, I see a lot of my clients that are listed on other exchanges, including the New York Stock Exchange, realize that they have to meet that standard. And part of that is just because of what you already said, Brian. The BlackRocks, Vanguard, State Streets of the world have an interest in seeing greater board diversity. And so I think we'll continue to see those developments take place. We do expect to hear from the SEC at some point this year on social issues, whether or not it'll be a board diversity rule that mirrors the NASDAQ rule. We don't know for certain. Right now in the US, everything is overshadowed by the fact that we expect to hear from the SEC on climate change disclosure regulation this coming Monday. So while the social conversation remains hot in the US, I think next week in particular, all that anyone's going to want to talk to me about is climate disclosure. And more on the overlap between the E and the S in a little bit, because I know as we've talked about, Brian, that's a really important area of development that I think gets some attention, is getting more and increased attention, but maybe not enough. And then finally, from a regulatory perspective, there are states, including California, that have adopted board diversity rules that can impact companies that do business in those jurisdictions. And all of this has resulted in greater board representation. There is still room for greater development, without a doubt, but we have seen the needle move even just since 2020. So 2021 was a big year for board diversity in the US. Moving on to kind of workforce diversity specifically, I'm going to put the EEO-1 data to the side for a second, because I'm going to talk about that in the context of shareholder proposals. But I mean, I think I've seen over the past couple of years in particular, a lot of my clients a lot more interested in diversity programs and considerations. Following the death of George Floyd, we saw a significant rise in the number of chief diversity officer roles. Those roles really need to be thought out, and I've written a fair amount on this topic. A lot of times those roles can become kind of lost roles in the organization if they're not adopted in the right way. Seen a lot more consideration around what goes into creating an effective diversity, equity, and inclusion program. I actually have an article coming out relatively soon on some of the key issues that I see in DE&I programs when I'm working with clients on how to create a more effective, more inclusive community within their organizations. And I think there's also been a greater focus on the reputational risks. You know, one of the things that I think we saw coming out of the murder of George Floyd were a lot of corporate commitments around social action, you know, equality, injustice in addressing these sort of issues. And some of those companies then received backlash, you know, a year or so later when kind of public perception was that they had not made enough progress. So I think there's also, you know, an increased focus on the reputational aspects of this. You know, moving to the shareholder proposal space, you know, you and I know, Brian, that we could spend hours talking about this. I'm not going to for obvious reasons, but just kind of quickly, what we're seeing for the 2022 season is a number of shareholder proposals right now. Out of about 500 submitted proposals that we're aware of to public companies in the U.S., about 127 of those are directly related to social matters. So that kind of gives you an estimate of the body that's taking up in the minds of and the attention of investors. Some of the most frequently submitted proposals for this coming year, asking companies to publish, to publicly disclose their EEO-1 data, which is basically the breakdown of race and gender among their workforce, or otherwise provide greater detail with respect to their DE&I efforts. Proposals on gender and racial equality, including proposals that ask for reports on gender pay, equity, pay, you know, whether or not there's a gap for gender or race with respect to compensation. Proposals asking for racial equity audits, which is an interesting development that have really increased this year. And at least 2 of those proposals have already passed, which is quite interesting. And then proposals regarding a myriad of other issues. So far this year, I'm aware of 4 social proposals that have passed. Again, those 2 on the racial equity audits, which is quite an undertaking for a company. And then 1 proposal requesting a gender and racial pay gap report, and 1 proposal asking for a report on the use of direct and indirect forced labor. And then I'll just finish up real quickly, Brian, you know, the overlaps between the E and the S. You mentioned this, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. From my perspective, there's really 3 big things that fall into this bucket. The first would be environmental justice, which is really considerations regarding the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws in a way that considers their needs and their long-term interests. And so we've seen in the US, you know, it's something that's on the Biden administration's agenda. It's an area of focus for them. And so I've definitely seen my clients and it become more of an area of interest, including, you know, how they think about who their stakeholders are, right? I mean, that's so central to how we think about ESG and how a company puts together its ESG strategy. The second thing that falls into this under this umbrella of the space between the E and the S is energy justice, which should not be confused with environmental justice. That's really the goal of achieving equity in the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens on those that have been disproportionately harmed or disenfranchised by the energy system. It also really critically considers matters regarding energy access and energy poverty, which, as I think we're seeing in meaningful and unfortunate ways nowadays, has to be part of the conversation when we talk about energy transition. And then the final thing, which you mentioned, Brian, is just transition, right? And there's a lot of definitions of this. Because it has become a somewhat politicized term. But my definition really would be an approach to the power shift from an extractive-centric economy to a more regenerative-based economy that considers the range of social issues including workers' rights and livelihoods, as well as the social considerations of those with varying ranges of energy access, right? So that brings in, again, that idea of energy access, which really should run through a lot of how we think about our transition, our overall energy transition. So lots of other areas of interest here. I'm not going to be able to touch on all of them. There's obviously also a focus on supply chain issues in the U.S. We saw the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act recently passed. So supply, I think, coming into the middle of 2022 and 2023, I think in the US, we expect to see a little bit more interest among investors on supply chain issues, forced labor issues. I think, we've seen the proposal out of the EU on some of these matters. And so I expect to see those trends start to be reflected in the US, although we do tend to kind of drag the play a little bit there. So that's an overview, Brian, but happy to engage and discuss anything else that anyone is interested in.
So there's a great takeaways there. A couple of things that really struck a chord with me. You were talking about the connection between tenure, independence, and this push for increased board diversity. And I think not only does it provide, more independent directors, right? It also provides, in doing so, a lot of new perspectives that are coming into the boardroom, and it helps identify some blind spots that companies may have otherwise had. And in doing so, that can really help companies perform and identify new areas of risk and opportunities for them. So I think that's part of the reason for the increased push from institutional investors and the proxy advisory firms, and even the listings, as you mentioned, from NASDAQ. There's evidence out there that shows and supports the theory that a more diverse board actually promotes a greater company performance. So I think it's really interesting to see how that comes together. The other thing that really ties in closely with the increased board diversity is the idea of overboarding, right? If there are a limit to the tightening and the restrictions of the number of boards that directors can serve on, that might potentially open up opportunities for new directors who haven't necessarily served on boards and might have an opportunity now because there are more open board seats for them to go and join. So I think it's a great way to see how these different policies all kind of tie together, ultimately to achieve a goal of having the boardroom reflect more of the diversity of America as a whole, and globally, these companies reflect the global population. So I think that's an awesome takeaway from me. You also mentioned about the 30% goal, and you mentioned how that is something that a lot of there's push towards, right, from institutional investors and the proxy advisory firms. Just for the audience, Glass Lewis, BlackRock, State Street, they're all putting out guidelines either for this year or next year that they either expect to see or they are going to ultimately have voting recommendations against people like the NOM committee chair if there aren't 30% diverse boards, and whether that's just on a gender side or gender and racial and ethnic diversity. So there is definitely a snowball effect of going from at least one woman on the board to at least two women on the board to at least one underrepresented minority. You'll see that kind of continue to snowball to where we can hopefully continue to increase the diversity in the boardrooms. So yeah, awesome takeaways from there. Thank you so much. Let's kick it back off to Francois or Pierre to delve a little deeper into the South African perspective.
Thank you, Brian. And some really interesting takeaways there. Even though South Africa is still a developing country, as opposed to the US, there's some interesting and similar trends. In 2016, the United Nations Environment Program actually reported that the financial sector in South Africa has been a leader and innovator in integrating ESG issues into its practices. Regulation has therefore been a key enabler of ESG integration in South Africa. So in the South African context, you have both legislative and non-legislative enablers. Given our past history of social inequality, unfair labor practices, etc., there has been some legislative reforms since the early 90s in a South African context. Firstly, we've got a very well-developed constitution with an entrenched Bill of Rights and labor legislation, including our Labor Relations Act and Employment Equity Act, addressing past inequalities as well as race-based inequalities. And for that specific purpose, we have a broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act redressing these. Then from a governance perspective, we also have the Home Loan and Mortgage Act, which enables government to oversee that there are fair lending practices in South Africa. From an institutional perspective, it's very interesting that similarly as in the USA, we have Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act that requires a pension fund and its board to, before investing in and whilst invested in an asset, to consider any factor, including social factors, which may materially affect the sustainable long-term performance of assets. Similarly, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority issued guidance notices in this regard that makes the consideration of ESG factors an integral to evaluating the sustainability of assets from an investment perspective in South Africa. In addition, the Public Investment Corporation Amendment Act also seeks to invest and promote sustainable development in respect of public pension funds of assets in South Africa. As you know, the Public Investment Corporation manages over 2 trillion rand of public pension funds and is the biggest asset manager in Africa. From a non-legislative perspective, we have certain enablers, and it's similar following the US trends of guidelines. For instance, the Association for Savings and Investments in South Africa and the Institute of Directors are industry bodies that lobby and provide industry guidelines, such as, for instance, the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa for institutional investors, thereby developing and implementing sustainable, responsible long-term investment strategies. And it's also outcomes-based and from an apply and explain regime perspective. So you can see that social factors is mainly driven by the financial sector in South Africa, and mainly driven by the financial sector. From a regulatory perspective, the ESG aspects are regulated by the Financial Sector Regulation Act, which have adopted a Twin Peaks formula where the banks in South Africa are mainly regulated by the Prudential Authority, and it lays down prudential standards for banks in South Africa. Other financial institutions are prescribed for by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, and it prescribes conduct standards for financing institutions in South Africa. In addition, we have stock exchanges, which are the self-regulating authorities, and that provides another ecosystem whereby investors and issuers can formulate for social kind of guidelines going forward. Eugene, I don't know if you have anything to add to the developments from a market infrastructure perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to pause and just look at SA. I'm going to refer back to our discussions 3 weeks ago related to environmental, because when you look at environmental and you look at social, there's important differences that have developed in terms of how the local market regulates it. And I think it was Simon Sinek who said start with the why. And if you look at the environmental side, it's very much an investor-driven proposition, with companies trying to reduce the underlying cost of capital or funding for an underlying project, or greening up the company, or reducing the carbon footprint. When it comes to social, it's an entirely different monster, and companies have had to think a lot more dearly in terms of how they entertain and meet those underlying social objectives. And the biggest driver over there has been it's very much in the political domain, and therefore a government-driven objectives there. Secondly, a large component of it resides already in the policy objectives of governments in terms of what they're trying to achieve on the ground, in terms of their social footprint, in terms of redress of past injustices. And then thirdly, and this is the real top one for companies, is it's very much a consumer-driven objective, and it's a lot easier to appease shareholders and investors than it is to appease the consumer. And losing those votes in the consumer segment for your product become incredibly punitive for a company in the longer term. And that reputational damage is a lot harder to overturn and turn around. And then I think the fourth one is what's happening in terms of South Africa in the supplier-driven segment, where they really are looking at scorecards in terms of how you're meeting your underlying social objectives in terms of gender diversity, race diversity, what you're doing around economic redress. And you're not winning contracts specifically in the governance space, but even in some of the underlying consumer segments if your scorecard doesn't meet with those objectives. So it's become less of an issue around the financing and the cost of capital, but it's become a real issue around the cost of doing business and even the ability to do business and the ability to reach a consumer segment. So it's with that in mind, the big focus has been on that underlying disclosure. So you get that disclosure into the right space, both at a quantitative and at a qualitative perspective. And also setting up those alignments, setting up those scorecards, setting up those underlying measures that they are achievable. If you don't set the target, you're going to miss it every time. And it's not just the staff, but companies, clients externally seeing that you are making determined efforts to reach that. So I found the social drive a significantly bigger contributor to company boards in terms of the action they're taking than the green agenda at the moment, which for myself is sort of a lot more nascent stage of its development than the social angle. So you, Brian?
Yeah, I think, so I want to get back to something that Sarah hit on a little bit about where the US seems to be lagging, maybe some European or potentially even Australian companies around like modern slavery and supply chain issues. It seems like this is a bigger focus for companies in other parts of the world and is now becoming integrated into US companies when they're evaluating their supply chain and setting up supplier codes of conduct and evaluating how their suppliers are conducting their businesses overseas. So Sarah, if you could just provide a little bit more context, because I think this is an emerging issue that is going to start to become more prominent over the next couple of years, particularly in more of like a retail driven company space.
Sure, Brian. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it is both emerging and also incredibly old, right? I mean, you can find articles from decades ago where companies faced the reputational backlash associated with, a factory burning down or something of that nature that was deeply embedded in their supply chain and perhaps maybe even not entirely within the scope of their control. But, I think increasingly there is an expectation, although not necessarily reflected in regulation fully at this point, there's an expectation that companies are doing more due diligence around their supply chain. And, I think this is one of the ways in which the E and the S sort of share some of the same challenges around, data compilation and integration. There's a massive data element to what we are trying to accomplish from an E and an S and a D perspective. And the degree to which companies have the ability to dig into their supply chain is going to be directly related to their ability to have visibility to all of the components that go into their products and services. And that actually can be more complicated than folks realize. But I think increasingly yes, I am seeing more and more supplier and vendor codes of conduct that include issues around labor and the treatment of workforces in general. I think there are particular industries that face unique levels of challenges in the space. I'll put it that way. But I do expect it to be something that continues to mature in the U.S. As we see actual regulation, potentially come into force and effect in the EU.
Another social issue that really caught my attention was after the attack on the Capitol, the heightened increase on political activity, lobbying, spending, political activity from corporations. And this is something that has really grown in investor support in terms of shareholder proposals over the past couple of years. These proposals now, when they're on ballots, they routinely pass, or they're definitely in the 40s. They're getting strong levels of support. And I think it's a great demonstration of how shareholder proposals are becoming more refined and are reflecting what is going on in a more current time when they are being put on the ballots. They are really reflecting key issues that are relevant to investors, to their consumers, and to companies at large, so that they can overall impact the societal message that companies are putting out there. So that's another key social issue that I've seen over the past couple of years really grown in prominence. I'm wondering, back on the South African side, is there anything that you guys heard from the American perspective, the US perspective, that resonated with you, something that you really are seeing come across the Atlantic and hitting your market? Or is there anything that you anticipate that is already in the South African market that you think might be headed west, headed to the US?
Brian, yes, what we've certainly seen is that South Africa is not a country operating in isolation. Many of our the big multinationals globally have very large footprints in South Africa and Africa. And what we have certainly seen is that the manner in which those companies treat their employees, and also the impact of that such a company's green footprint, the impact on the environment, totally has a social impact as a very direct result. For instance, one of the South African companies that are listed both in America as well as in South Africa, over the last 2 years have seen their single biggest risk being community-related impacts caused by the environmental, the impacts on the environment. And what we've seen is that they do excellent in terms of the environmental, sometimes on the environmental front and even on the governance side. But on the social side, it just seems to be something that is lagging on the ESG chain. And they might even have human rights policies and procedures. They might have anti-sexual harassment policies. They might all have that, but we see that this is still not an important boardroom agenda point. If something like that happens in the workplace, we see that it would rather be managed in the corridors as opposed to on a board level and reported to the shareholders. And that, specific mitigation measures are put in place so that it doesn't happen again. So for us, the most important part that we have seen is companies certainly are identifying their risks, their ESG risks, much more pertinently, in line with the broader ESG matrix, and they assess on a material assessment basis their performance on a regular basis. Then in terms of mitigation strategies, we see that local jurisdiction focal points is aligning themselves with international holding company or group rules, and it's really from the CEO tone at the top down to every single business unit below that. Certainly, we have seen an increase in ESG-related policies and strategies with defined accountabilities for ESG management, much more regular monitoring and reporting beyond the criteria for voluntary ESG-related monitoring and reporting. And last but not least, we see that as part of the annual strategic reviews, and with that, the budget reviews, we see that ESG matters for companies now, and that they certainly include that into their whole planning process. Thank you, Brian.
Appreciate it. So we're getting close to the end of time. So if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to submit them. We will do our best to address them now. I thought at this point, if we don't have any questions, I may provide some of the things that I'm probably most interested in monitoring over the next few months during the 2022 proxy season here on the US side. Maybe somebody else wants to provide some of their perspectives on what they think are going to be some of the key things that they're watching out for during the rest of this year. So one of the things I'm probably most keenly interested in monitoring, we mentioned earlier, the racial equity audits. This is a relatively new shareholder proposal initiative, really started last year in earnest, and it has really grown exponentially this year. There's far more proposals that have been put out there. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these proposals fare in 2022 versus in 2021. Not that they did poorly in 2021 by any means, but it seems like they might be poised to do even better in 2022. In 2021, looking through some of the data, ISS generally opposed these proposals because ISS felt like the targeted companies had already done a lot in this space, and they'd already taken some meaningful steps to address some of these inequalities. Now, as these proposals are rolled out more broadly, that might change, and I think that's going to be something to see. It's going to be something that I'm definitely going to be interested in monitoring how that goes forward. Is this going to be the type of proposal that gets even more support than it did last year? So that's certainly one on the shareholder proposal side that I'm particularly interested in. We also talked about the DEI reports, where in addition to the EEO-1 disclosures, shareholders are requesting information on companies' DEI efforts, on the effectiveness of their programs, essentially. What are they doing and how are those programs doing? How are they promoting recruitment and retention of underrepresented groups? So I think this is another area that is going to be really interesting on the S side to see how these shareholder proposals fare in 2022. As has been said many times on many different panels and in many articles at this point, E&S proposals broke records last year. 2021 was a really groundbreaking year for the environmental and social shareholder proposal space, with a record number receiving support, and those that didn't receive majority support still did quite well. So with more shareholder proposals out there, it's going to be interesting to see if that trend continues. My anticipation is that it will. I think that we have really seen a really changing of the guard in terms of the way some of the largest passive funds are viewing some of these proposals. And as they become more likely to support with the number of shares and the percentage of outstanding that they control at a lot of companies, you're seeing increased overall numbers of support for shareholder proposals across the US. So those are some of the key things that I'm looking forward to in 2022. If anybody else wants to provide some of their key insights for what they're expecting in 2022, I'd love to hear them.
I think we always talk to the warm and fluffy stuff when it comes to social. What I'm looking forward to in the year ahead is to see more and more CEOs and directors talking out to the alternative points of views. I think what has happened is it's easy to cotton on to the easy issues. I think it's hard to sometimes piggyback onto the harder and the tougher issues. And I'm looking forward to see more CEOs in the public domain talking to the more difficult points, even if it is Elon Musk tweeting on some points I don't agree to, but I do expect more of that in the new year.
All right, well, thank you all so much for your time today. Really appreciate all of the panelists. You guys did an excellent job. Definitely some great takeaways that I am going to keep in mind as we continue on this start of the 2022 proxy season. Some of the trends that you identified, I will certainly be looking out for. Thank you to the audience for your time and participating today. If you think of a question offline, our email addresses are available. We're happy to share this deck with anybody who would like it. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. On behalf of Alliance Advisors and the Cape Town Stock Exchange and all of the panelists, thank you all for joining today. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
everyone.